Hello and welcome to Hawkeye Nation. This is Hawkcast, your Iowa football, basketball, and recruiting podcast brought to you by Go Iowa Awesome and Rivals.com. I'm your recruiting analyst and host, Eliot Clough, at Eliot Clough on Twitter. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have got loads of content ahead for you with the transfer portal, men's and women's basketball headed to Ames tomorrow, today and tomorrow for that matter. And then, of course, all the offensive coordinator news that we don't have at this moment in time. Joined by Adam Jacoby, publisher of our site, Ross Binder, managing editor as well. If you are watching or listening to us on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button, drop a like, drop a comment, tell us all your thoughts on all the things we hit today. And of course, if you're listening anywhere else, hit that subscribe button, leave a rate and review. We're going to start off talking a little bit differently about women's basketball to start. Caitlin Clark, of course, the sensation that she is at Iowa, but talking basketball is a new thing at this moment in time because it's been all football all the time. And Adam Jacoby, our women's basketball beat writer, they're taking on the Cyclones tonight in Hilton Coliseum. So tell us all about that matchup. Are the Hawkeyes heavily favored in this one? I know Iowa State tends to have pretty good women's basketball teams as well.
Yeah, ISU does tend to have some pretty strong teams, but this is a bit of a transitional year for the Cyclones. So Iowa is heavily favored. Let me take a look real quick here at what the line is. Yeah, they don't even have a line posted on ESPN.
I saw one. I saw one on Twitter that was 12.5 points for Iowa.
That is lower than I expected, honestly. ISU is tough. They're 4-3, 3-0 at home, and this is, it's the rivalry is always weird. Go ahead.
I think the line's factoring. I was going to say the line's factoring in Hilton Magic, probably.
Yeah, I would think so. And the fact that they're favored by double digits in Hilton Coliseum is a little bit wild, right? But ISU, this is sort of a freshman forward team for them. Audie Crooks in the middle is somebody that Iowa really, really took a shot at. And unfortunately, she did stay in state, but not for the Hawkeyes. She's 6'3" wide, but a really talented scorer of the basketball. There's another Jones there, of course. This one's Kelsey. And so it's a young ISU team, and they might just be young enough to be dangerous. But Iowa, is on the other end of that spectrum. And if Hannah Stuelke's not in the starting lineup here, and she's working her way back from an ankle injury, according to her parents, the school's telling us nothing about Stuelke's injury for the record, but her parents say it's an ankle injury. She is trying to work her way back to the team. She may or may not play tonight against Iowa State, but that is going to factor into it. If she's not in the lineup, then in all likelihood, that's going to be a lineup where Caitlin Clark, the career all-time leading scorer in Iowa basketball history, and she passed a lot of Titans to do it, will be the youngest member of that starting lineup. All-time greatest scorer is a Hawkeye, youngest starter. Yeah, and Eliot is peering at the camera. The reaction I got from Lisa Bluger when I asked her about it on Monday morning. And it's like, look down the line. Molly Davis, 6th year. Kate Martin, 6th year. Gabby Marshall, 6th year. Molly Davis is a 5th year, but Kate Martin, 6th. Gabby Marshall, 6th. Sharon Goodman would be the 5th member of that starting lineup other than Caitlin. She's a 4th-year player, too. I talked with Bailey in the Iowa information department, and apparently she's older than Caitlin. So that's all 5. Caitlin, the youngest. So that is so much experience. That is so much camaraderie, connection that they've developed with each other. Now, obviously, you go to the bench, and there's a lot of younger, really talented players. And as soon as Stuelke's in that mix, it's no longer the case. But the fact is, I was going to be bringing a very, very old, by college standards, a very, very old lineup to that floor on Hilton. A bunch of players who have seen a bunch of things, and they're going to be going up against a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds. So big, big disparity in terms of experience, in terms of age, and all of that. Does Hilton Magic play into that nonetheless? We'll see, because this has been a weird series, and ISU finds ways to beat Iowa in ways that people don't really see coming, and vice versa, especially when ISU's good and Iowa's maybe in a transitional year. So really, it's going to be tough to call how this one shakes out, but it also just might shake out as another blowout. We'll see.
So for Stolke, I take it she's listed as questionable.
Yeah. Has been, and we're not really getting updates from the team on her for whatever reason. Coach Bluter even said something to the effect of, that's a personal decision on her part. And so I'm not going to get into it, which sounds strange coming from a coach, but there is a world, and I don't know whether or not this is true, but it's possible that what happened was she and her family just never signed the release that all athletes have to sign before coaches are allowed to talk about anything medical with them. So, if that's the case, then Bluter's hands are tied, and it's, it doesn't serve any purpose for her to say, oh yeah, she didn't check the form, blah, blah, blah. Right. That's not, good coaching, but that is a scenario that would make sense. But, her parents are also active on social media, and they mentioned that it's an ankle injury. So I don't think it's anything that is, secretly awful or anything like that. And I do have a little bit of intel that Hannah has returned to practice, so she may or may not play in this game. I would consider her questionable. And again, we did not get any sort of a status update from Coach Bluter, and the way that she talks about it versus the way that she talks about other players' injuries, her hands really might be tied, off camera in terms of what she's allowed to say. But I do expect Stolke back sooner rather than later, maybe even tonight.
Now, you might not be able to quantify it, but what would you have a gauge of what percentage you would say in terms of likelihood she's going to play?
50-50. And that's only because there's a yes and there's a no. Because we're not there's only so much information that we're getting in, but we know that she is in uniform for practices at the very least. So I'm calling it 50-50, questionable. She may or may not go, but I do expect her back in that rotation sooner rather than later.
We have heard quite a bit about the reception that Iowa men's basketball receives when they arrive at Hilton. At least I have heard a little bit about that from Jordan Bohannon on a few podcasts. Do you expect that to be the same for the women, especially given how much Caitlin Clark is a sensation, and she's one of those players that you love to have, but that you hate when she's on an opposing team because she's so good?
Absolutely. She's a magnet for attention, positive and negative. And every time she goes on the road, that negative attention comes. The thing of it is, it doesn't faze her in the slightest. And, we asked her about that on Monday morning, and she said that having all those big, loud, raucous environments to go play in on the road is more enjoyable to her than playing in empty arenas, right? It would be sort of a letdown to walk into an arena that's half full at this point. And that seems to me a pretty healthy way to look at it, especially when you've spent enough time in that spotlight that there's really not anything that's going to happen to you on the court, or anything you're going to hear out of the stands that's going to be like, all right, that crosses the line, right? There's just none of that left, and she's spent enough time and she has thrived in this pressure for so long. If ISU's fans get as raucous as I think they're going to, and I do, I think that's going to be a great environment, and I wish I were there tonight. I will be in Madison, but not going to be there tonight. I think it's going to be an incredible atmosphere, and I think the Iowa players are going to have a lot of fun in it. I don't think they're going to be shooketh. I don't think it's going to negatively affect the way they play, because again, we're talking about 4th year, 5th year, 6th year seniors, and a bench mob that has their coach's trust and doesn't get, yanked out at the first mistake they make. They're empowered to play, as loose and free and as confidently as possible. And so that is something that ports over very, very well to tough road destinations. And I especially with a lineup as experienced as this is. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun for the fans. I think it's going to be a lot of fun for the players. And I think it's going to be good television too.
I hate that I laughed when you said shooketh. I really do. I'm so upset with myself. The transition to the men. Is there anything else that you wanted to add regarding the women's game? I see you got something to say, Ross.
Yeah, I was just gonna say two things. Caitlin Clark's never won in Ames before. This is her last chance to do so. I don't think she's gonna pass that up. And she's also, I believe, 22 points away from hitting 3,000 career points. So that is yet another milestone for her to hit tonight, perhaps.
At the other
Something to
state
watch.
school, she broke the the Iowa scoring record at UNI. She'll pass
That's true.
3,000 points more than likely at Iowa State. A travesty. Sorry, you were saying, Ross.
I'm sure she'll get some records in Iowa City too. But yeah, so just things to watch tonight. I'm sure she didn't have a great game the other day against who were they playing on the weekend, Adam?
Bowling Green.
Bowling Green.
Yeah.
You may have a little bit bigger game tonight, but either way, it should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'd be a little bit nervous playing in front of Ted Lasso too. So I've never seen the show. Jason Sudeikis, still a good actor. Jason Sudeikis. I'm a fan. Now for the men taking on Iowa State as well. That's tomorrow night at 6:30. Again in Ames. ISU coming in 6-2, 4-0 at home. Iowa 5-3, 0-2 away. Granted, two of the most raucous environments. One at Mackey, the other one against Creighton. Of course, Mackey being Purdue. And tonight, they're only given a 23.2% chance to win at Iowa State, according to ESPN. Iowa State, they are favored by 7.5, and I don't blame them. This Iowa basketball team has come out flat on a regular basis in terms of energy. The defense is lacking, which you would expect. Of course, they've got freshmen that continually play in the lineup that do play at a high level for freshmen, but they are indeed freshmen, and they're taking on two really talented other freshmen in Iowa State, Omaha Ballou, and of course Milan Momcilovic there for the Cyclones. So with all of that said, it's going to be a tough one for Iowa in Hilton Coliseum tonight, as they are taking on a pretty solid Iowa State team. Ross, I know you handle our previews. Have you looked into it super in depth to this point?
Not a whole lot just yet. Obviously, the Cyclones are off to a really good start to the season. So, and Hilton's always a tough place to play. So I'm expecting very difficult game for Iowa. Do you know if is Tony Perkins available for this game? And he was going to his grandmother's funeral, I believe.
So yes, Fran talked about that the other day. He said he's going to be traveling back from Indianapolis from his grandmother's funeral, and he should be available. That is my understanding.
Ooh, that's going to be a difficult thing for him to go through, I think.
So yeah, we talked about that after the game. Just earlier this week, or excuse me, that was last week, when Iowa came out and they beat North Florida. Tony led team in scoring along with Ben Krikke. I believe he had 21 points. They had 21 points each. Kind of came out on fire, and you could tell he was emotional after the game. All the teammates and coaches there hugging him and talking with him after, and you could tell that, and you could tell early that he was in his zone as well. He said that himself, but you could tell early. He said the memories of his grandmother were flashing through his head as he was playing. So just, I think, an incredible testament into who Tony is and playing at a high level, despite the fact that he had a heavy heart. Of course, we wrote about that following the game, but looking forward to seeing how he responds tonight as well. I mean, he was so pivotal in the win last year at Iowa too.
Yeah, I mean, I think Iowa State's obviously going to be a much different challenge for Iowa than Purdue was. For one thing, there's no Zach Edey, which is nice because he was a absolute monster in that game. But Iowa State is a more guard-oriented lineup. Lipsy is currently leading them in like everything. He's leading them in scoring, rebounding, and assists. So he
And
is
steals.
Mr. Do It All for them, and steals. Yeah, he's Mr. Do It All for them. And I think just having Tony there from a defensive standpoint will be helpful to try and slow him down. Um, Offensively, like you said, Iowa's come out flat a lot, so I think they need to, and that can be really dangerous at Hilton if they come out flat and find themselves down 15 points inside 8 or 10 minutes. That's a real danger zone for sure for this team. So they need to get off to a pretty good start and be hitting some shots early.
Yeah,
This
containing Lipsy is going to be really interesting to see because he seems like a guy that's really going to feed off that Hilton crowd and make the sorts of plays that they really really get ignited off of, and just had a triple double against I believe it was against DePaul, and sort of a rare occurrence in ISU history and in pretty much any men's college basketball history. And even in the game prior to that, which was a neutral court against A&M, great team, by the way, like he had 14 rebounds in that game. So including 5 on the offensive glass. And we're talking about a 6'1" guard getting 5 offensive rebounds. So if I was not prepared for that level of just pure energy and hustle, and again, if you're going to do that in any court in America, you're doing it at Hilton Coliseum, that crowd's going to go bananas for it, especially against the Hawkeyes. So these guys have to understand that Lipsy knows how to play to that crowd, how to get them riled up. The crowd knows, how to turn a game. And it's just going to be 40 minutes of effort. And you're going to have to navigate some runs, some loud, raucous environments, and probably, knowing what we know about Hilton, probably some really rough calls too. There is probably going to be a little bit of Hilton magic going on there. But just like the women, this can be a weird rivalry at times. There can be upsets that just come straight out of nowhere that don't make any sense. And I mean, gosh, what was it? 2 years ago or 4 years ago that Iowa went up like 20-2 on these guys? And it can happen. This is not a logical rivalry. So I'm curious to see how this shakes out, but it really, really does have to come down to Iowa has to come ready to play for 40 minutes, or else it becomes really predictable. And that prediction is about a 20-30 point ISU win.
I mean, even look back to last year. What a weird game. Iowa State couldn't shoot to save their lives. Chris Murray didn't play. And then the Hawkeyes come out and win by 20 or however much it was. Like, and I remember watching that game and just be like, okay, when's Iowa State going to make their run? Okay, when's Iowa State going to make their run? And it just never happened. And this is a very different team than it was last year in terms of, I mean, they had those the 2 transfers from St. Bonaventure, no longer with the roster. Of course, they've moved on. Iowa, very reliant on freshmen this time. No Murray twin. It's gonna be what I want to see in this one is Peyton Sandfort step up and hit some big shots, because we haven't seen him do that in these big games more or less. Of course, I didn't watch the Seton Hall game because of craziness of travel and the Nebraska football game. Ross, I don't know. Did you see him do that in that game? Or I've only seen him do it once or twice against some of these mid to low major teams they've played so far this season.
Yeah, let me just I did watch that game. What happened in that game? I think he got hot in that game. He was good in that game. He had 22 points, 7 of 12, 4 for 10 from 3. Yeah, I do remember that. Now he got it going, and Iowa kind of built a lead in that game and just kind of kept Seton Hall at kind of arm's length. They never really, I think they led almost the entire game. And the second half, it was never like a oh, Seton Hall could take the lead on this possession type game. It was always a at least 5 or 6 point lead for Iowa, as I recall. And yeah, he was a big part of that. When his shot is falling, that offense just looks so much better and is so much more dangerous than when his shot is ice cold, which it's been in those big games you referred to. So I agree. He's kind of the linchpin for this game, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He's because if you're getting, use your words, Adam, if you're getting 20 to 25 points out of him in an environment like this, I mean, gosh, look at their trip to Rutgers last year. That was a game where riding that, those clutch shots by Sanford, that gets Iowa to that lead, helps them maintain that lead. And it's a lot easier, especially for a team structured like Iowa is in the way that they play. It's easier for them to play with the lead than to try to make up a lead, even though we've seen some pretty remarkable comebacks from them over the last few years. Ultimately, this is a team that plays a lot more comfortable with the lead already in hand. And so if Sanford, if he really wants to show that he can perform in any environment, that there's not going to be anything, the lights are never going to be too bright, and that you want the ball going to him when everybody else in the building doesn't want it going to him, here's where you do it. Here is where you prove that you are that ice cold, cold-blooded assassin that everybody should be afraid of you for being. So it's an opportunity. It's absolutely an opportunity. And he seems like the kind of guy that enjoys challenges like that. And if it's also like the trip to Rutgers, we might also see him get his second technical. And again, like that's the funniest thing to see Peyton Sanford getting teed up. It's like getting a technical foul call on Mr. Rogers. Like, where did this come from?
Peyton is the second leading scorer on the team this year. The shooting percentages are actually better than I thought they'd be. He's shooting 34% from three, which of course you want that to be a little bit higher, but 42.9% from the field. 13.6 points per game. He leads the team in rebounding at this point, which is probably not a great thing, but he is averaging 7.9 rebounds to Tamin Lipsey's 6.5, who also leads Iowa State. So not exactly going to be the greatest of interior presences in this game on the glass and on defense, which leads me to my next point. I think the fan base is clamoring. I don't know if clamoring is the right word. You could say that I'm clamoring, and we'll hit this quick and move on to portal and more football stuff. But I think that Owen Freeman should start. Everything that I've seen lends itself towards that. I mean, he's been the Big Ten Freshman of the Week 3 weeks of the 3 of the 3 weeks, right? At this point, and then pretty much where we're at. And that ties, that ties Aaron White for the most in one season. We've got 3-4 months of the season left. Like, Owen Freeman is very clearly one of the top players on this team already as a freshman, leads the team in blocks. I would think he'd lead the team in rebounding if he were starting and, playing as many minutes as I think he probably should be. He's playing 15 minutes a game at this point, which I don't love. I think you want that around closer to 20, just because of the sheer impact that he's made. And I mean, he's fun as hell. 2, he brings the energy. And 3, again, he's one of the best players on this roster already. I'm a huge fan of Owen. I think he has just a maturity beyond his years on the basketball court. Sure, he's going to make mistakes like any freshman would, but he is a player that has those fun plays, the big dunks, the 3 blocks in about 5 seconds against North Florida. You got to insert him to the starting lineup at some point, in my opinion. I don't know who goes to the bench, but I don't think Fran is exactly going to bench his son in order to put Owen in the starting lineup. And any question that has been fielded from him about starting with Owen, he just kind of shirks it. He kind of dismisses it. But you can only do that for so long with the way this team has performed early on in the season, in my opinion. And it's not like it's been awful, but they haven't beaten Seton Hall. You should have beaten Seton Hall. Oklahoma's number 19 in the team in the country. Purdue's going to be a top team in the country. Creighton's going to be a top team in the country. You competed with Creighton. You did not compete with Purdue at all.
Yeah. And they
think
more or less competed with Oklahoma. I mean,
right.
Sooners
That was
were
an
always going
ugly
to win
game.
that game. Yeah. Yeah. But, they, at the very least, they gave him 40 minutes. The problem with Freeman, like, I do think Freeman's one of the top 5 players on this team. The problem is, so is Ben Krikke. And you look at the way that Fran has been using those 2 guys, and it's pretty much a platoon system. There are sometimes Krikke will be on the floor as the 4 with Freeman as the 5. It doesn't happen very often, but that is the way that they use the 2.
Been happening more.
Yeah, and I would like to see it more and more, because I think that he's one of the 5 best players on the team. Before I see him in the starting lineup, though, I want to see him in the finishing lineup. I want to see him. I want to see Fran's level of trust in him, that he can have him in after the last media timeout of the game. Because once that happens, we're talking about that turnover rate, which is currently at about, I'm looking at it right now, like the 13.2 on Ken Palm, which is about where Krikke's is, but it's higher than Tony Perkins. It's it's higher than pretty much any rotation guy except for Brock Harding, and you would expect more turnovers from Brock Harding for many reasons at this point in the season in his career. But it does mean that there are mistakes in Owen's game, and as long as you're trying to guide him and develop him and work those mistakes out, do you want them happening on the floor, or do you want them happening in practice and a shorter leash for him on the floor? I would say if the goal is to win games, you sort of have to look at the rebounding that Freeman brings, the blocks that he brings, the offensive efficiency that he brings. We're talking about a 69% free throw shooter, scores pretty reliably from the field. I think he's trustworthy enough that you can live with the mistakes. And I don't think that they're game losing mistakes, but you do really just want to make sure that the game is slow enough for him that he can play at the end, and that you say, we need one play, Owen, go make one play, and they're going to try to stop you, go do it anyway, that he is going to have that level of polish, that level of trust from the coaches. That's where I want to see him get. I think he'll be there by next year at the latest. But I do think it is probably in Iowa's best interest, just with so much of the good that he brings to the table, to be playing more than, what'd you say, 15, 16 minutes a
15.
game. Yeah,
yep.
It's just not enough. And get Krikke to the 4 if you have to. But it's just, you look at the way that the team plays with Freeman on the floor versus off the floor, and Krikke on the floor and off the floor, it's pretty obvious that Freeman's one of the best 5 players on the team. It just is.
Well, I agree with what you're saying, Adam, but I also like Eliot's point about those flat starts, and I do wonder if you start Freeman, can he help with that? Because they have had a lot of games this season where the energy is just not there, and it's a struggle. And then sometimes the second unit guys come in and they do provide that spark that kind of gets things going. But maybe he could do that from the jump. I think it would be worth trying, but I will say, having watched Fran for over a decade now, he is not one to tinker with his starting lineups a lot unless it's obvious that a change needs to happen, or injuries or something force a change. Like, he's not one of those coaches that's constantly tinkering with his starting lineup and trying different combinations. He really likes a set starting 5. So we'll see what comes of that.
And with this amount of freshmen, I'm sure he likes to have the older guys start the game too. But when it continually gives you these slow starts, man, something's got to change. It's the same conversation we had the other day. Do you let it sit for 3 years, or do you change it? Football and basketball are quite different in that respect, because you play a lot more basketball games than you do football games. But that is a conversation that maybe you have sooner rather than later. And it doesn't have to be detrimental to any of the guys who are starting. Light a fire under their ass, man. Oh, a freshman starting over me? I've been here 4 years. Well, Pick it
Yeah,
up.
do something about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Additionally,
Some shot.
I'll make a quick point. I love almost everything I've seen from Desante Bowen this year. I think an aggressive Desante Bowen adds a different dynamic to this team that we don't see otherwise. I think he's gotten much more confident at getting to the basket. He's a much more confident shooter. I love his intensity in the full court defense. Like, he's just been a different player this year in terms of confidence, and that's taken his game to another level. So I'm a big fan of him and what he's done so far this season.
Yeah, I agree. And it is something that Fran sort of hinted at before the season, that it was something that he had seen from Desante in practice. I think the term that he used was he really should have played him more last season. Sort of easy for you to say that after the season's over, right? But yeah, I absolutely agree that Bowen has taken that step up, the step that he needed to take. And walking into Hilton, we talked about a great opportunity for Peyton Sandfort. Here's one for Desante, right? You play like that in this environment, it's a whole lot more difficult to do that than to do it at Carver Hawkeye, or to do it against Florida A&M or Arkansas State. Play like that when all the lights are on you, when everybody else in the building is rooting against you. Play like that. Because if they can do that and they get something out of Sandfort, they get a good shooting day out of Sandfort, and they keep their wits about them, which is, again, easier said than done. Yeah, I do think they have a chance to make this competitive. But it really does start with guys taking advantage of the opportunities that are in front of them.
All right, now let's make a transition into football. We hit it briefly at the end of the podcast on Sunday, Monday, talking a little bit about the transfer portal. Now that it has opened up, we've seen a few guys enter. A surprise in Ontario Thompson. But other than that, Brendan Diaz-Fernandez, Deontay Vines, also a bit of a surprise, Jackson Filer, and of course, the not so surprise, Joe Labus, who decided to enter the portal yesterday. Like I said, Thompson and Deontay Vines, probably the biggest surprise. Thompson, way more of a surprise than Deontay Vines, but we talked about it on Sunday night in terms of what needs Iowa could go after in the portal. And I think it's just been exacerbated. We talked about wide receiver and defensive tackle, and it's just been exacerbated by what's happened in the last 24 to 48 hours. Thompson, the biggest surprise, because I think we all saw a path for him to see significantly more playing time next year. And it would have been fun as hell, like I said, to see him with Aaron Graves. But now he's entered the portal, and he was receiving just group of 5 offers. Now it's up to Oregon State and Indiana in terms of Power 5 offers. So the likelihood of him returning out of the portal with those Power 5 offers now on his plate becomes less and less likely.
Yeah, I was surprised to see Terrios name the list for all the reasons that you mentioned. And I understand where that interest is coming from the other schools. I was also a little bit surprised that, as you mentioned, the level of offer that he was getting straight out of the gate was in that FCS group of 5, sort of, the mid-majors of college football instead, and until, now we're getting to that Oregon State, Indiana, et cetera. That was where I expected him. And, it still seems like the best place for him to end up in 2024 is Iowa. I think in terms of an environment that is conducive for him to develop into a pro player based on the schools that we've seen are interested in him so far, I still think Iowa's his best bet. But of course, that's looking at it from a strictly football and NFL standpoint. And there's so many other factors that go into these decisions that these kids are making. And, they're half my age. I get to call them kids. So I'm curious to see how that situation develops. I'm still not putting it at 0% that Ontario comes back, because I know that the Iowa coaches had some plans for him too. And they like to keep bigger rotations, especially on the defensive line, than, the D line, and the way that Phil Parker uses the D line starter. And I'm doing air quotes for those not watching on YouTube. Starter is sort of a loose definition, and it doesn't really always accurately reflect the amount of snaps that these guys get and how important they are. And, when they're on the field, Ethan Hurkett's a prime example. Ethan Hurkett didn't, quote, start a game this year, but he was always on the field and making plays in the fourth quarter. And he's made comments to the effect of the coaches say, I'm sort of like a starter. And you look at the snap counts, you look at, when they're using him, when they're trusting him, and, essentially it is true, but it's just that there's Joe Evans right there. Come on, let your captain start. So that's a situation where it sort of seems like Terrio would probably not start if Y.A. Black is back next year. And I bet he wants to, but he would get snaps on this line. I firmly believe that he would be in that rotation to a greater extent than he was this season. Now, also Pittman's in that mix. And, is Pittman working his way up too? Because all of a sudden that's a little bit more crowded than it was before. And so a lot of different factors to, worry about. But ultimately, you look at an eye test guy like Thompson, which he very much is. And you just you watch him play, you watch him make those plays on special teams, and you think, oh, he'll be on the line. Like he will work his way into this specific rotation, and he'll be better off for it. So maybe transferring makes that process quicker for him. I'm not sure the process should be quicker, but that's, me talking from my strictly football outside perspective. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out.
There are.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Oh,
go ahead, Ross. Nope, you.
I was just gonna say, if he does end up leaving, it's a blow to Iowa's D tackle rotation. It's also a blow to the special teams because he was a definite weapon on special team. He blocked 2 kicks, and that is not an easy skill to replace. And he certainly would have been a part of that rotation or that unit next year. I would anticipate. So
yeah, that's a skill that's not going anywhere, right? He's not going to forget how to block kicks or get worse at it.
His arms aren't going to get shorter. So, if he ends up leaving, then I think D tackle becomes a definite area where they would need to, target a replacement in the portal.
Yeah, ASAP.
There are a couple things that I think of, and that I think most people think of with Ontario entering the portal. One is, does he want more NIL money? Which that's got to be a factor when almost anybody enters the portal, especially they're going to a different school. If they feel like they're going to be more valued in terms of NIL money, like that's just a factor of where things are currently. Do I know that for sure? No, I don't. That's speculation. Yeah. Secondarily, I went back and listened to Coach Kelvin Bell, media availability earlier this year, and he referenced players in the rotation that weren't starters. Of course, it was Logan Lee and Y.A. Black as starters on the defensive tackle positions this year at the 1 tech and the 3 tech. He referenced Aaron Graves, Luke Gaffney, and Jeremiah Pittman, did not say Ontario Thompson's name. And then I look at something that Jay Neiman said, which I'll read it directly from the article that we posted on Iowa.rivals.com about Ontario Thompson's decision to enter the portal. This is Jay Neiman, quote, "I don't want to put expectations on him to start next season. Obviously, that's our hope, but that'll come through hard work and just beginning to understand the intricacies of his position a bit more. He's an athletic and explosive guy for his size. Hopefully, all those physical qualities will translate over into playing the D-line." What is it? It just seems, well, I need to go back and make an edit. It just seems like something that would be automatic, but it's not. You have to learn how to use your power, strength, and size through being fundamentally polished. Right now, like any other new player to our program, it takes time for guys to learn how to do that. So maybe Ontario sees an opportunity elsewhere where he can fit in a little bit better defensively. And maybe he doesn't like the way they were using him on the defensive line. But again, something that he said earlier in the year after that block on the against Western Michigan was that he always wanted to come to Iowa, and he went to Iowa Western in order for him to end up at Iowa. And now here he is in the portal after just 1 year, a spring and a fall with Iowa.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch. I will keep my fingers crossed for his sake, because again, I think Iowa is ultimately his best destination for 2024. You know, if Alabama or Georgia or Ole Miss, or if an SEC team comes calling, best of luck, and anyone would understand at that point, especially if you're going to get on the field quicker than you would at Iowa. But sort of what I was alluding to earlier in terms of like the process should take longer is exactly what you said, that the coaches don't really trust him in terms of that, like, play to play, keeping his technique solid, keeping the, his assignments all straight. That part of the development doesn't usually get, better, doesn't become, it's not a good thing to transfer away from a school like Iowa if what you really need to do is develop your skills as a defensive lineman, right? Even if you get on the field quicker, you're playing quicker as a less polished player, as a less well-coached player. I don't think that is ultimately in Terrio's best interests, but I'm also not him. I don't know what his best interests that he's looking out for by transferring are. So it might be the case that this has nothing to do with football. It might be the case that it is only about 50% to do with football. And if that, go find what you're looking for, obviously. But yeah, it's a surprise for a player like him to transfer away from a developmental program.
And he shouted out Coach Kelvin Bell in his statement too, that he was leaving. And Coach Kelvin Bell is a guy that has repeatedly developed guys. You think Lucas Van Ness ends up as a first-round pick at every other Power 5 program? No. I do not.
No,
I do not. Now, one other player that I mentioned that wasn't a surprise, we can hit Deontay Vines quick too, because he was kind of a surprise, but not necessarily really. I don't have a whole lot to say on Deontay entering the portal, other than the fact that it's something you and I agreed on, Adam. He's a kid that's so difficult to not root for, right? He's great with the media. He's just a good guy. He's had a lot of, his uncle passed away during the season. He got his first touchdown right after that. And it was a hard decision for him. He told me, we messaged a little bit after he made his choice. And again, that quote is in the article that, well, I guess I take that back. That's on our premium boards. So you can check that out, iowa.rivals.com/subscribe. But tough to see him go. Wish him the best of luck. He got a Pitt offer right away, which I was not exactly expecting. I know he's from out there, but I was figuring it was going to be more G5 kind of stuff. He did get an offer from UConn and UMass as well. But the Pitt offer was like, bam, right after he announced. He got that Pitt offer. I really don't have anything else to say on the subject. It's not exactly a surprise, but I wasn't saying, he wasn't the first name that came to my mind when I was thinking about guys who could enter the portal.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. And it seemed like, clearly there was going to be a path for him to start at wide receiver at Iowa next season, obviously. He was, even when he came back from that wrist injury, when he had no starting experience to fall back on, as soon as he was back and healthy, within his second week, he was back in that starting lineup, or like in the starting lineup for the first time. So obviously the coaches believe in him as a top receiver in that room. And even if you say, well, what about Caleb Brown? When Vines was healthy, he was starting over Brown. Fans might not agree with that decision, but it was the case. And the way that Kirk runs this program, it was probably still going to be the case next season if Deontay wanted it, or at the very least, he would have had that first step in terms of where that competition was going to be this fall. That all said, you look at the numbers that Deontay had, 228 yards through 2 seasons. And even though he was hurt for, portions of both of them, it was still, you look at, the totality of it, it was still more than one season's worth of games. And he had 228 yards, 1 touchdown, 22 catches. And somebody like him is probably taking stock of the time that he's got left in a college football uniform and thinking, especially after Charlie Jones, thinking, you know what? It might be nice to just go somewhere and catch 1,000 yards worth of passes. Just do that. And if that's the case, great. You know, like if UConn can provide that, UMass, even Pitt, I don't know. Like it sort of depends on what he wants too. But he's a guy that is at the very least very well in terms of what he wants, and you know, living his own truth. The fact that he was candid enough with us reporters to talk about, you know, his decision to stop drinking, for example, which is sort of something that he came to while he was rehabbing his wrist injury, that it was, you know, another sort of thing that was sort of taking away time that, you know, he wanted to spend in better ways. And so, you know, I'm not going to sit here and call Brian Ferentz's offense and excessive drinking a 1-to-1 apples to apples comparison. But, you know, insofar as they can be a thief of joy to wide receivers, understandable, right? Like they can inhabit some pretty similar spaces for very certain individuals. So, you know, if what Vines wants most is somewhere other than Iowa City, great. It's too bad, and I'm sure that the coaches are like, well, there goes a starting wide receiver, but it's also understandable. And so that's about enough that I've got to say on that.
You mentioned catch 1,000 yards worth of passes. He's got to catch them.
Yeah,
I will say that.
Yep, and that's why, you know, it's mostly UMass and UConn coming calling.
Yeah, right. Ross, anything to add on Deontay?
Not too much. I mean, I think it's surprising only because, like Adam said, there was a clear path for him to probably start next year. You know, either at the position he's already been starting at, or, you know, Nico is gone next year, so, you know, the potential is for, you know, one of Deontay or Caleb to potentially flip over to that side and start, you would think, possibly at least. So, you know, certainly there are opportunities for him. You know, he has a lot of experience in the program, but I can't say ever surprised when a receiver decides they've had enough of the Iowa offense. I mean, it's it is what it is, and for a receiver, it's pretty grim at times. So I wish him well, like you guys. I mean, he seems like a really good dude. I think he worked his tail off all the time he was in Iowa City. Wish he would have been healthier. Wish he could have been on the field more. But yeah, I just really hope he is able to do well wherever he lands.
The other player I thought would be good to make a point on is Joe Labus entering the portal. And not necessarily specific to Joe. It's more so that Iowa enters their bowl game with 2 scholarship quarterbacks for the second year in a row. 2 available scholarship quarterbacks for the second year in a row, one of them being a true freshman. Now, Deacon Hill will have more experience than Joe Labus did going into that game. That's for sure. Obviously, Spencer Petras got hurt, so he couldn't play. Cade McNamara gets hurt, so he can't play. So technically 3 scholarship quarterbacks on the roster, but 2 that are available. Yeah. I've seen people repeatedly say that, time to see Marco. You really think that's going to happen? First of all, no. Second of all, like, have you forgotten who the head coach is? And it's the same dude that's been there for the last 25 years. Second thing is, I would not consider now the time to throw in a true freshman against an SEC team that is a top 25 team in the country, and you've had him sit all year. It's like, oh, now's the time, Marco. Good luck, buddy. Really? That's not going to happen. There's no freaking way. Now, what I was going to make in the reality, what I was going to make of the point is that this is the second year that's happened. 2 scholarship quarterbacks on the roster going into a bowl game. What does that say about, one, the development of these quarterbacks in this program, and 2, the turnover, because it's not the same 2 quarterbacks. It's 2 different quarterbacks.
Yeah.
This isn't, whatever they're doing right now is not working.
Well,
and I want to hear your rebut on that, Adam.
Well, as Kirk would tell you, well, the guy that we thought was going to be quarterback ended up getting hurt during the middle of the year. Don't know if you knew about that.
He would say that.
Would say it right to your face
point.
too. No, it's not the point at all. It wasn't the point back then either.
The point, they really do need to make a better effort in terms of how they develop these quarterbacks, because 18 months to get a guy ready is not feasible in 2023. And it puts your it puts your offense in these positions where guys are just not ready for the jobs that they get when they're put under center for reasons like, I don't know, a quarterback's quad or ACL blowing out, which the coaches will tell us often they can't control, and it's part of the game. So the fact that they already understand that guys can go down with injury, and yet their system is still, it takes 18 months minimum to incubate a quarterback. And when they get in the system, they're throwing 15-yard passes. They're running the same bootleg play action that defenses have seen since the 20th century. They are right. There's a disconnect between what we're asking the quarterbacks to do and how long it takes to get them ready to do that. And when that disconnect exists, you get things like, for the second straight year, 2 healthy quarterbacks, and they're not the same 2, either of them. So that is, point number 5,783 in terms of why Iowa's quarterback development needs to be overhauled. Shock to so many people at that point. Ross, any further thoughts on the quarterback situation before we get into some actually good news on the transfer portal front?
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of things to unpack with the quarterback points. You mentioned the different faces, but that's kind of inevitable. They lost Padilla last year to the portal. They lost Petrus to injury. So, there were going to be new faces. Obviously, I agree with the point about quarterback development. That's something we've touched on throughout the fall, and that's one of the biggest problems with the program, and something that has to be fixed before they can really fix a lot of other issues on offense, I think. But speaking to this particular, and there's a little bit of bad luck involved. You have a quarterback with season-ending injuries 2 years in a row. Iowa had phenomenal injury luck with quarterbacks for a long time, and now it feels like it's, I guess, evening out a little bit. Maybe they lose Petrus last year at the end of the season. They lose Cade at the start of the season this year, regrettably. So those are just kind of weird circumstances, and the nature of the portal means you're going to have guys who, once they it's clear that I'm not the guy here, I need to go somewhere else to find an opportunity. They're going to leave in this time of year, like early December, after the regular season's done. They got to get in the portal so that they have that's where they're going to have the most opportunities of teams available for them to try and land at for their next school. So I get why I think Padilla jumped the same time last year, and why Labus jumps now. This is the best time for them to do that. So I think all of that combines to leave us with, oh crap, we've got 2 scholarship starting quarterbacks going into the game. And I will disagree with Eliot about the Marco point for one reason, and that is if Deacon gets hurt, I do think Marco would come in as the replacement.
Yeah, Ross.
His red shirt. So I'm saying there's a scenario for Marco to play, but it's not likely. I would agree for sure.
I was actually saying Tommy Pahulski.
Yeah.
Right. I was actually saying it's Tommy Pahulski time, Ross. So maybe you do have a point.
Tommy.
He is the 3rd string quarterback going into this one. Walk on Tommy Pahulski. So, and no, just because James Reeser is signing in December, he will not be available to play in this game. Just so you know, he's not graduating early, nor will he be prepared. But they probably
he lives just 2 hours up the road. I mean, it's a quick drive down to Orlando.
They'd probably, you'd have to imagine they were running Sam Laporta at quarterback in practices last year. So you'd have to imagine they're doing something with the Wildcat if that takes place. But we shall see when we get there. Either way, 2 scholarship quarterbacks, not ideal in this circumstance, but on the positive side, where we are with the transfer portal, where Iowa is with the transfer portal, 2 Caleb's returning for sure next year, as they said on Instagram Live last night or 2 nights ago, right? Adam, you watched it?
2 nights ago. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was surprising news because as late as the Northwestern game, there had been some rumblings that was it for Caleb Johnson. And excuse me, you could sort of see why. It made sense, especially with Le'Shawn Williams getting the bulk of the carries and doing a lot with them. And, I don't think Caleb played a snap against Northwestern. So it would be understandable, and especially for other Power 5 teams to look at him and say, oh, we can use him. Oh, yeah. Right. The talent that Caleb Johnson has is undeniable. He just had rotten luck with injuries this year. And the fact that there's only one ball that you can hand off. And sometimes that ball's just going to have to get handed to Le'Shawn. Sometimes it's going to have to get handed to Jazz Patterson, right? It's a crowded backfield there, and they're happy about that to an extent. But it's understandable that if what you really want is 1,000 yards or 1,200 yards or, X number of touchdowns, this is probably not the offense or the running back room that's going to get you there. That all said, they hop on Instagram and they say, we're Hawkeyes for life. And I believe it. And part of the reason that I believe it is because it's bigger than football to these guys, that they have cultivated such a camaraderie with each other. And some of that has to do with NIL for that matter. And that's a consequence of NIL that hadn't really been predicted or talked about. But the way that the Swarm operates is that these guys get essentially compensated for volunteer work around the community. And of course, if you're going to do volunteer work that you're going to enjoy, and then you also get paid to do it, not only are you going to want to do it, but so are your buddies on the team. And so, Eliot, how many times have we heard these guys talk about the time that they spend together off the field, whether it's doing these NIL projects or they're going to the movies or stuff like that? Like, they have created this very, very tight-knit group in a way that is, if they were trying to fake it, if there were any dishonesty about it, they probably would have stopped talking about it by now. It is something that is really genuinely important to them, and it gets talked about a lot also by recruits in terms of what the staff talks about, what they can expect when they get in here, that it becomes this very tight-knit sort of thing, and they just keep spending time with each other and deepening those bonds. And so it, from a football perspective, that was positive news to hear that both Caleb Johnson and Caleb Brown, who had his own hiccups this season, and who probably also had numbers that he probably would have expected to be higher, that they're both committing to come back. A big part of that is who they're coming back to, and the situation and the happiness that they have in Iowa City, regardless of what their stat sheet on ESPN says or this or that. One other thing that I'll point out in terms of that IG, while they were on, Deacon Hill hopped on there too, and they both had a really, really good rapport with him. They're joking, they're talking about, oh, why didn't you invite us to the movies? And he was like, well, why didn't you get off Instagram, et cetera, right? Like, one, you see that confidence continue to build in Deacon Hill, that he can be joking around with his RB1 and wide receiver 1, and they treat him like a QB1 there too. And that was a data point, anecdata, if you will, but it was something worth noting that they don't treat him like the guy who's just sort of sitting in Cade's chair, that, they enjoy having him around and he enjoys having them around, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it's not the end all be all. It's one little thing to notice, but it's a positive thing to notice. And so that was interesting to see. And it was sort of consistent with the growth and confidence, Eliot, that we've seen out of Deacon all year. It seemed like week 12 Deacon and not week 6 Deacon. And so the fact that that's carrying past the media rooms, past the field, past, the regular season, that's just how he is now. Very, I would say, positive for people who are, thinking about buying stock in Deacon Hill from here on out, I would say.
Did you guys see a few people tweeted? I didn't see it. I can't verify it for myself, but apparently Cooper DeJean said on an Instagram live, he said something like, "Who says I'm leaving?"
I saw the same thing you did, Elliot, but I didn't actually, see his comment specifically.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Well, can't verify it. Didn't see it. Just saying. Since we're talking about Instagram Live and all the kids doing their doodads with the internet and stuff. So
we're the old ones, Elliot.
I'm still old compared to these college students. When I say, "Oh yeah, when I was in college," I'm 27 years old and getting senile over here. Anyway, talking a little bit more about what's going on with this offseason, we did want to hit on the topic of the offensive coordinator and the approach there for Iowa, because they haven't hired somebody yet. Penn State was on it like that with Andy Kotelnicki, and coming out of Kansas, a few other hires have been made. And typically when you're going into an offseason, you want to get that done so you can point to this person, to players in the transfer portal or coming out of high school. This is going to be your offensive coordinator. This is going to be the guy you're going to be working with. And if it's a guy, there are a ton of names have been thrown around, right? Like for example, Coach Bud. I've talked to several recruits that love Coach Bud. Deacon Hill loves Coach Bud. Keller Christ is an analyst on the Iowa football roster, and Paul Christ is his uncle. And you can point to all these things that he did as the OC at Wisconsin. This is a guy that Kirk Ferentz admires, trusts. And when you have a guy that Kirk Ferentz trusts, he can point to these things, X, Y, Z. This is why we get along. This is why I like him. This is why he'll do a great job with you. This is where your, abilities come in and where you'll be. And so they haven't done it. Who knows when they'll do it? If they wait till after the bowl game, it's too late to be able to say that stuff. Really, it's way too late. It'd be silly.
They cannot wait until after the Citrus Bowl, and unfortunately, I think that is a realistic possibility with Ferentz and the way he's handled things in the past. But that would be a disastrous move. I agree with you, Elliot, because they need the portal's open now. There's literally thousands of guys in the portal. If they're going to try and get guys out of the portal to try and enhance this team for next year, especially on the offensive side of the ball, where they continue obviously to need help. I think we'd all agree on that. Those guys want to know, who's my OC going to be? Who's calling plays, who's designing game plans, etc. And Iowa can't afford to just sit out the month of December, I think, on that issue. So this
is the guy going to want to bring in
a timetable.
Right. No, he hasn't.
Right.
Not that I'm aware of.
But the sooner the better. There's no delay there. Adam has his figure raised.
One thing that I'll point out is that this time 12 months ago, Dejon Parker was committed to Virginia. He backed out of that commitment, ended up at Iowa, precisely because he did not know who his coach was going to be at that time. And so he made that switch in early January. And if Iowa wants to play that game with its offensive coordinator, they already know, there's already one guy who's on the roster right now who is like a totemic, personification of what happens when you don't have your coaching staff sewn up for next year after, by the time all the bowls are done. You lose recruits like that. And I understand the reason that Kirk would want to not deal with that until after the season. It's his kid, and we worry about next year, I believe is his phrase. But recruits that are worrying about next year are doing it right now. Right.
The portal guys are worried about next year right now.
Right now. And it's fine to say we'll worry about next year. That's a luxury the staff just does not have. And if they want to be in denial about it, I'm sure they've earned that right. 25 years, up to 25 years. But I disagree. And I think the recruiting will bear that out.
It's going to be a distraction with, Brian being the OC on Jan 1, whether they hire someone before then or not. Like, it's going to be an issue to discuss and an issue that, is a distraction from everything else because the decision was made to keep him through Jan 1, or at least through the bowl game.
Yeah.
So that, that die is cast. I think the best thing you can do at this point is, what can you do to make sure that next year's team is in the best position possible? And that starts with hiring an offensive coordinator sooner rather than later. Yeah.
And watch them wait until January 2nd to hire somebody, and it's like Tim Polasek. How uninspiring is that? Oh,
don't speak that into existence. No disrespect to Tim or the Polasek family, but oh boy.
Yeah. And then, so the other thing I was going to say is the recruiting pitch, if there's one to be made about the staff right now, is, well, it's not going to be Brian. Like, that's all you got. If you're pointing to your OC, it's not going to be the guy that has sucked it up over the last 3 years. And then
but
additionally,
it also just means that you're not getting recruited by the guy that's going to coach you. And that is so frustrating for players.
Unless it's your position coach. And for right now, all I've been aware of is position coaches are focused on high school recruits and their guys in the building, as far as I know. In terms of the folks that have been reached out into the transfer portal and such. And I can elaborate more about that on our premium board if that's something that's warranted. But in regards to the staff and the assistants, who's to say that the new OC won't want to bring in his own guys, right? Like, that's important too. I don't know how much of these guys are going to be retained, right? I mean, like, if I had to lean one way or another, I'd say a lot of them are going to be in there because Kirk, like, for example, has raved about George Barnett. So Coach likes George Barnett. Coach Ferentz likes George Barnett. I haven't heard him talk specifically. Right, exactly. I haven't heard him talk specifically about a guy like Kelton Copeland out, publicly and such. But Abdul Hodge is good at what he does. Liddell Betts is a former Hawkeye. Like, these things just add up to them being retained on staff. Yeah. Now, you bring in a guy like Paul Christ, who has this, again, conjecture here, who has head coaching experience, offensive coordinator experience. Is he going to want to bring in his own guys in certain positions? Right? That's definitely a possibility. Is it not?
I mean, it's a possibility. I think it gets back to the question that we've all had about the new offensive coordinators since, we find out Brian would for sure be gone next year, which is, how much is Kirk going to continue steering the wheel here? Like, is he willing to cede more responsibility to an offensive coordinator, or, is this someone that's coming in just to, bring his vision of the offense to life, Frankenstein style? If that's the case, then I don't expect that person to have much say in terms of replacing other coaches on the staff or much influence. If it is, a case where he really is ceding more control to somebody else, then I think you're right. There is a possibility of other changes on that offensive coaching staff. But, until we see kind of where Kirk's leaning, that's tough to say, for me at least.
Yeah, I think that is ultimately, Ross, the central conflict through all of this is if Kirk's fingers or fingerprints are going to be on this offense, how much does it actually matter who the guy is going to be? because there have been incremental changes over the years, but there's been a few things that have not changed over the entire 25 years. And some of that is because the head coach hasn't changed and is famously stubborn about the things that he does and doesn't change. So, I think it'll be very interesting to see how what you guys have talked about, like how that staff shakes itself out, what sort of autonomy the OC has in terms of who his position coaches are. Kirk does not seem like the kind of guy or the kind of coach who would be like, yeah, go ahead and fire my running backs coach, right? That I don't expect that per se from him, but if there's a way that this gets handled and these guys are leaving on their own volition, for example, don't call this Adam says Kelton Copeland's on his way out. This is an example, but let's say Kelton Copeland
What's going on our TikTok?
No, for crying out loud. Generic coach X. Let's say generic coach X announces, I'm taking an opportunity at my alma mater, right? But the OC, whoever it is already in place at that point. Whether that replacement position coach has more connections to the offensive coordinator or to Kirk Ferentz, I think will signal how much autonomy this offensive coordinator has to develop an offense, right? It's, again, we're reading tea leaves here. It's sort of like a soap opera with a Sphinx as the main character, but that is at the very least an indication that we can use for what the next offensive coordinator's job is even going to look like.
Yeah, well, and I think your point too about, replacing coaches, like you could count on one hand the number of coaches that Kirk Ferentz has fired in his 25 years at Iowa, and you don't need all the fingers to do it. So, he's not, no new coordinator is going to come in and like clean house, as it were, or anything like that, I don't think. But yeah, there's the potential there for some other changes, maybe, possibly, if someone gets another opportunity or wants to do something else, whatever. But yeah, I'm not seeing someone. I don't see someone getting fired from the Iowa staff. That is just not the way Kirk has operated for over 2 decades now.
There's fired, and then there's you should take a job somewhere else.
Right?
Yeah,
ushered out the door, which is definitely a possibility.
And even that's a possibility, and even that hasn't happened all that often. So right. I mean, it's just the assistant coaching gig has been a very stable one in the Iowa football world for a long time. So we'll see.
And for good reason for guys like Abdul Hodge and Liddell Betts, right? Like those guys are good coaches.
Yeah, they
not necessarily
from Kirk. Yeah,
right. Not necessarily. It's not like the wide receiver room has had a whole lot of success, right? And this is not me saying Kelton Copeland should be fired or
going on our
out.
TikTok.
But it's something that should be talked about with the performance of the wide receivers. Why don't we say that? And sure. One thing I did want to hit on, I don't know if we've really podcasted about this before. Of course, I have the article on iowa.rivals.com about the potential candidates, which you can find on our website if you want to go digging, or you can search Iowa's next offensive coordinator potential candidates, rivals, and you'll find it. There's a picture of Kirk and Paul Chryst at the top there. But I list the most likely candidates at the top as John Budmeyer, Paul Chryst, Tim Polasek, and then LeVar Woods, who I see as the, I guess, more likely hires at that offensive coordinator spot. Do you guys like, if you were making the hire, do you have a preference? If you look at it and say that guy should be the OC, do you have a preference? Like, where are you guys in the thought process here with who ends up at Iowa as the OC?
The only other name I would add to the list that you brought up there is Joe Philbin, who is former former assistant with Ferentz, so he's got connections. Former head coach of the Dolphins. He's got a lot of coaching experience all over. Currently an analyst at Ohio State, so wouldn't be hard to get him away to be an assistant. But my leaning would be towards someone like Chris or Philbin. I think probably someone that has a lot of experience, that is an analyst, so they can come in right away. And there's that either familiarity with Ferentz already that Philbin has, or that Chris has not worked with Ferentz, but I think they seem very simpatico. There's a lot of mutual respect there, obviously, and just in terms of the way they see football and see offensive football, I think there's a lot more they agree on than disagree on. So that would work well. My personal preference for a radically transformed Iowa offense, like that's not going to happen as long as Kirk Ferentz is the head coach. So, and maybe they don't even need a radical transformation, honestly. But so yeah, I think that's kind of where I would lean. What about you, Adam?
Yeah, this is sort of a situation where do I want to incorporate what I think Kirk Ferentz wants or not? Because if I'm going that realistic route, yeah, sure, Paul Chryst probably seems fine. And I'll go sort of one step further with Chryst. I think Kirk would be happier with having Paul Chryst around, and because they're just sort of similar personality wise, right? The first opportunity that they get to, like, when acerbic Paul Chryst comes out, Mr. Turnover Chain my ass, like, if that Paul Chryst comes to Iowa City, Kirk is going to have a blast. Like, that might be his little fountain of youth right there, is bringing in another like salty 60, 70-year-old guy at that point to like bounce all that, like, what happened to the game I love sort of energy, right? It's got to have some sort of an outlet somewhere. I'm only about 50% kidding on that point. Joe Philbin, I think, is a great choice on pretty much exactly those same terms, and no one's ever doubted that guy's football IQ ever, and he's got the hardware to back it up, and the NFL experience now at this point to back it up too. But he's getting up there just like Kirk is, and does he want a role like that, which is not necessarily the like labor lift that being a head coach is, but it's awful close. Like, where it might not be 100 hours a week, but it's probably 80. Does Philbin really want to do that at this point in his life? Does Chryst really even want to do that at this point in his life? Maybe yes, right? Like, maybe just being in that room makes it easier than if it's in New Mexico or what have you. I don't know. In terms of what do I want to see? You can't watch these teams out west, Washington in particular, or Oregon in particular, and not think, well, why can't Denbrock come to Iowa, right? Or why can't the Grubb guy at Washington, like, why not him? He's even from Iowa, and some people have said, oh yeah, Grubb's a guy that you really need to target. This would be at best a lateral move for him, especially now that Washington's in the Big Ten, right? Like, why? Just because he's from Iowa. Like, I'm from Iowa myself, but you're not gonna. If I was living in Seattle, the fact that I was from Iowa, just like, I'm not moving from Seattle to Iowa. That's no disrespect to the Hawkeye state, but if you've ever been to Seattle, you understand. Great city. Anyway, so I would say if we're talking fantasy candidates, Grubb, realistic candidates, like someone who wouldn't make that Kirk would actually want to coach with, Paul Chryst would be it for me.
Of the four names that I listed, Tim Polasek is immediately crossed off for me. Yeah. Okay. I considered it a realistic possibility because he's been on staff before. He was an offensive line coach for the Hawkeyes, and I've heard he's similar to Brian Ferentz. We'll say that. So you don't want chances are you don't want him to be the OC at Iowa. What I will say is at the point of the writing of that article, by that point in time, Iowa was ranked 131st in total offense. I looked up Wyoming and their rankings, being that they are G5, thinking, oh, yeah, they'll probably be 70, 80, something like that. What did I find? The performance increased from 131st to 124th.
Yeah, it's the same caveman. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want that guy as your offensive coordinator. I'll say that. I have a buddy who's a Wyoming fan for some reason, and he's basically said the same thing. You do not want that guy to be your next OC. I look at a guy like LeVar Woods, and obviously he's done incredible things at every single spot he's been in. But do you elevate your special teams coordinator to your offensive coordinator? Right? Like how does that really make sense? Right? Like just in terms of football. And that's not me questioning LeVar Woods. That's just questioning me questioning the decision to move from one facet of the game to the other. And then I look at Coach Bud, who has not had a ton of success, a ton of success as the offensive coordinator at Colorado State in his 1 year there. The Rams averaged 23.7 points per game while putting up 163.9 yards per game rushing and 251.8 yards per game passing, which is a hell of a lot more than what Iowa's done. But they also finished with a 3-9 record, and it's group of 5. And he only did it for 1 year before their head coach got fired. And since then, previously to that, he was at Wisconsin. Then he ended up at Colorado State. Then he ended up at Iowa. And there hasn't been a whole lot of things that I have seen in terms of on-field product that he has put together that has made me say, that's the guy. I've heard a lot of positive things about him off the field, again, between recruiting, Deacon, and Cade. And if he's the guy and he comes out and he's successful, then awesome. Do I see him as the first choice? No, I do not. To me, it is Paul Chryst. Again, things did tend to fall to the wayside a little bit with his offense when he took over as the head coach at Wisconsin. But when he was the OC there, things went swimmingly. You mentioned the relationship aspect of it with Kirk, Adam, and to me, he's the choice. Do I see things necessarily going the way that, the folks would like them to? No, I don't, because it's Kirk Ferentz. But whether or not that aligns, and I think that's the realistic choice for people. You're looking, obviously, you get your pick of the lot, and it's Ryan Grubb. It's the guy who just got let go from Houston. People have been saying that. Oh, he went to Iowa. Well, have you met Kirk Ferentz? For the second time in one podcast, have you heard the guy talk? Secondarily, Ryan Grubb is not going to make that lateral move, probably for less money, unless he's a head coach in waiting, which I don't see them operating as such. And so realistically, I think the people's choice is a guy like Paul Chryst. I don't know enough about Joe Philbin to speak on him, but to me, the choice is Paul Chryst with the way things sit, unless we're just shocked out of our minds and they make some surprise hire somebody else. George Barnett has previous co-offensive coordinator experience. Do I see them elevating him to OC? That would be a hell of a shock. I don't see that come to fruition. But Adam, it looked like you had something to say in there.
Well, one thing I'll point out, what works at North Dakota State, what works at Wyoming, what works at Colorado State is predicated a whole lot on the fact that you're playing opponents that have to sort of pick and choose where they're going to be good because they have limited resources, just like you have limited resources. You try to bring the caveman stuff to the Big Ten, and unless you're in the Big Ten West, which is about to, head out, and mercifully so, right? The opportunity to win with that 1950s offense in the Big Ten is effectively closing with the removal of divisions and the entry of your Oregon, Washington, your two LA schools. One with the talent that they bring in, because they're going to be great not only from 1 to 11, but 12 to 22 and 23 to 33 on defense. Like, they can recruit good, fast, strong defenders up and down their depth chart. So, we have seen the incremental loss of efficacy. We'll put it that way, as the Big Ten has grown and as the money keeps coming in. At some point, it just really does become more about the guys on the field than the X's and O's that you're giving to them. That all said, you do have to have some X's and O's that come from the 21st century. And, does Paul Chryst have some of that in him? You would hope so. You brought up Dana Holgorsen, Eliot. I would sooner see Kirk coaching shirtless on the sidelines at Kinnick Stadium than Dana Holgorsen being his OC. Prove me wrong, Kirk. I'm begging you to prove me wrong, but that guy is Dana Holgorsen is sort of the guy that you would see at a craps table and not in Vegas, in Washington, Iowa, at whatever casino that is, at 3 a.m. with a concerning amount of Red Bull in his system. As a fit goes, it sounds catastrophic, which means I want to see it. Morbid curiosity, really. But fans would be happy for a while, but it's sort of the same way that fans were happy in Madison when Luke Fickell decided that he was going to go air raid. That's fun in April, right? You can be excited about that in August. It didn't shake out well for them. And I don't know if even in this weird psychotic scenario, Dana comes to Iowa City and says, all right, Kirk, here's a way to make an air raid succeed. And here are the 10 different changes you need to make. He's probably getting one of them out of Kirk, right? It would be a disaster. And again, we don't know that Iowa's got the dudes to make a system like that work. And I mean, it would be a multi-year recruiting reclamation project at that point. That all said, it's Holgo, so I want to see it.
I would sooner see Kirk Ferentz coach pantsless than they hire Ryan Grubb. So glad we were thinking the same thing in that department, Adam.
Hope it doesn't come to that.
Yeah, that would be walking around in tighty whities on the sideline. Right. So that's, I mean, we've reached to a stopping point where I don't feel like there's a whole lot to add on the offensive coordinator spot. I think there is a general, I don't know if frustration is the right word, but everybody's antsy, waiting for that offensive coordinator to be hired, especially in the fan base. And of course, we'll have coverage of it on iowa.rivals.com as it comes. And when we get some information, we will share it on the premium board for those who are subscribers. We've got transfer portal covered. We've got recruiting covered. And of course, we've got that OC search covered, and basketball recruiting and signing day right around the corner. You want to be a subscriber right now to get all that information from us on iowa.rivals.com. If you are listening on YouTube, please make sure you hit that subscribe button down below so you do not miss an episode. Same thing for Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the platforms you can listen. And if you are on YouTube as well, hit that like button, drop a comment. Who do you want Iowa to hire as their next OC? And be realistic about it, would you? They're not gonna bring anybody in from the NFL or anything like that, unless it is Joe Philbin or whatever he's doing. Ohio State, that's where he's at. Anyway, make sure you subscribe, do all that stuff for us. We really appreciate it. It makes us very happy. That'll do it for us here on this episode of Hawkeyes. We appreciate you tuning in. For now, we will see you next time.